3, 2, 1. Welcome back to Walk with TFB. Tim Bryson here, and as y'all know, I'm a Black millennial who's eager to have unfiltered conversation with authentic people centered on education, sport, and culture. Today, we are walking with a former guest, but again, a friend, as she said, a co-conspirator and disruptor, and someone who I know is going to share invaluable but also valuable information for us to consider as we set the tone in the framework for what we'll be discussing throughout the week. This guest is someone who serves as a director while also serving as a PhD candidate at the one and only Howard University. As I said before, we interviewed her on the Walk with TFB podcast before, and so I'll drop the podcast link into the chat for y'all to review at a later date. But without further ado, future Dr. Tonija Hope, what's popping, my friend? What's popping?
Hello, future Dr. Bryson. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
I appreciate it. You got me, like I said, I had to drink my coffee, man. I had to get a double espresso from Starbucks, you know what I mean, to really get excited for this conversation, though I wanted to drink some rosé. But I did wear my floral shirt because I know you travel a lot, right? So the next time you go anywhere floral, warm, please take me with you. I'm a student too.
I will work on that. Yes, indeed.
Let's get this thing going, man. Segment 1 is what's your story? And as I said before, right, we interviewed you on the podcast before. So we're not going to spend too much time talking about your story, not because it's not important, but because, again, we'll reference the podcast episode from last year. But for those who are on the call who may not know who you are, and for those who do know who you are, just tell us more about your story, but particularly, you know, how you landed in international education, and more specifically, how you ended up in your role as the director of the Bunche Center at Howard University.
Sure. So I have been the director of the Ralph J. Bunche International Affairs Center at Howard University, approaching 8 years now. In July, it'll be 8 years. My path to this role is a little bit, it was not a direct line, let's just say. I've always been interested in all things international from as far back as I can remember. My mother is born and raised in Liberia. My father was born on the campus of Howard University and raised between there and Beirut, Lebanon. So I have international in me, in my DNA. And I grew up always hearing, you know, I grew up in Washington, D.C., so that in and of itself is a very international, it is a very international and cosmopolitan city. But I grew up with family who traveled a lot, who spent time in other places or were from other places. And so my whole life, I heard all the time about other places. And so they weren't really other to me. I just maybe, you know, didn't know them as well, but they still felt like I've never been to Beirut, but I feel like I know Beirut a little bit because my father always talked about Beirut. So between the childhood and Howard, I worked for 12 years for Jose Andres, the chef, in his restaurants, which were also not American restaurants. They're, you know, Spanish restaurants or Latin American restaurants or Greek, Mediterranean restaurants, what have you. And everybody that works in those restaurants, for the most part, came from somewhere else. So they were in and of themselves international spaces. I spoke Spanish on a daily basis with a good portion of the staff that worked in those places and with Jose. And so for me, making the transition from the restaurant business to international education at first seemed like a stretch. But once I made it into international education, kind of international exchange field, everybody around me made it very clear the transferable skills that I learned from the restaurant business. And then I was like, yes, of course, that makes perfect sense. I mean, I was honing my intercultural skills on a daily basis because people were from all over the world, and both people that worked there and people that dined in those places. And so it was a constant learning experience, and it was beautiful. And so making that transition into the NGO nonprofit sector was fairly easy.
And as you think about your career, right, moving out of the restaurant business into more formal international education roles, particularly within the U.S. higher education system, Just talk to us more about your current role as director of the Bunche Center, right? Because I think a lot of both commentary, but also how visible you've been on social media, begins to paint a picture. But I think your role in particular, again, at Howard, at that speaks volumes in regards to the work that you're currently doing, but also how you're shaping the future of international education as well.
So the work that I do at Howard, first of all, no day is the same at Howard, which is
Sure.
partly why I love my job, because I don't like monotony. That's partly why I enjoyed the restaurant business too, because every day was different because you always had different people. We had some people that were the same, but it was always, for the most part, different people. And that's very similar to my job now. I get to dabble in all aspects of internationalization. And I know we'll get into what that even is later, but I get to work with students all the time. I get to work with faculty and staff. I get to work with people external to the university, policymakers and other colleagues in other universities or NGOs. Oh, there goes the dog. And so I get to do all of these things all the time, and it's just so fun and interesting and I hope meaningful. I think it's meaningful and impactful for not only students and faculty, but also, if we zoom out to the world and kind of what we need to be doing in the world in terms of building bridges and bringing people together, understanding people more across borders and boundaries and different things. This work allows me to do that in a variety of different ways, and I love it.
So you talk about building bridges, right? And again, this summit is focused on internationalization in sport. And so I'm curious, right? Because a lot of our people on the call right now, some may work internationally. I think many others are in the college sports space in particular, at least sport adjacent. What conversations and the relationships have you seen, whether it be at Howard, your role, and or other director of international affairs centers across the U.S., in building bridges with the other side of campus, if you will, with college sport?
I said building bridges with who?
College sport, college athletic departments.
Oh yeah. Well, I think that's a bridge that needs to be built a little stronger. is what I think. I know, when I first started working, because working at Howard is my first time working in higher ed. And, I had to learn a lot in terms of how the different spaces work together or don't work together in a college campus. And I think, what I found is, well, right off the bat, I had to go out and build relationships across the whole entire university. And the athletic department was one in particular that I was particularly focused on. And I didn't know that I was going to be focused on because, this came up in different conferences. There'll be not a lot. So this is an area that you're going to definitely be filling a gap. But I remember one or two sessions at a conference. I think I saw one at like the Diversity Abroad conference. They did one on athletes and kind of the lack of opportunity for athletes to do study abroad. So that was my initial kind of introduction into the need for there to be more dialogue between the athletic department and the International Affairs Center. And so I met the athletic director. I'm like, hey, what are we doing? And, it's funny. He was all for it. And probably maybe 2 years after I got there, our women's volleyball team is they're MEAC champions. And so, they won our league. And so they said, we're going to take our women's volleyball team, we're going to take them abroad. We're going to do I don't know what you call it, a showcase tour or something. And they went to Zimbabwe and Botswana. And there's a lot of press about that because they were the first Division I volleyball team to do one of those trips to the African continent. And I think, and again, we're going to probably get into this later, but and actually just you asking me this question and me coming with this answer speaks directly to Black internationalization, because of course it would be an HBCU that would choose to go and do their tour. They're not going to the typical places where these companies and organizations typically arrange visits. It's because Howard University said, we're going to go to the continent. We're not going to go to Western Europe. We're going to go, basically, we're going to go home. And they went to Zimbabwe and Botswana. And again, first time a D1 team has done that. So
this is good. Segment 2, we're just warming up. And like I said, this is it's just a very heartwarming conversation, because we've had these conversations. Shout out to Dr. T. Wood, Dr. Taylor Woodman at Maryland University of Maryland. But we talked about this in a number of different ways over the last couple of years, right? And I think anytime I bring up sport, I either get eye rolls from people in the crowd in the international ed space, and or they jump straight to student athletes and study abroad. But in a very similar way, the international athletes, to which I focus on in the US, they're studying abroad and competing in a sport. It's the same thing, just a different exchange, different way, right?
just different direction, yeah.
But we can't even get to that point, because again, as I'm starting to look at like why are more international athletes coming to the US, obviously we're seeing professional leagues, play competition and preseason competition in other countries and continents. But until I took Dr. Woodman's class and I heard the word internationalization, I'm like, now this shit makes sense. Like, this actually makes sense now. And so for those who may not know what internationalization is, I would love for us to first start with the ACE definition, or, like thereof in many ways, in regards to what comprehensive internationalization is, before we jump into Black internationalism and your framework, Black internationalization as well.
So you want to talk about what the definition is?
How would you describe it for those in layman terms? How would you describe internationalization?
So I think the fundamental thing to understand about internationalization is that it is a process. Study abroad is not internationalization. Incoming international students is not internationalization. Internationalizing the curriculum is not internationalization.
Yep, talk about it.
These things are all elements of the internationalization process. And the process is an ongoing thing. And so it is not, and well, the definition that I use, I use one definition, the Dr. Knight's definition, which is the process of integrating an international, intercultural, and global dimension into the purpose, functions, or delivery of post-secondary education. I use a new definition in my dissertation, which adds to the beginning of that the power and the process of integrating an international, intercultural, and global dimension into the purpose, function, the delivery of post-secondary education, because the power of that process, it's not a neutral thing. There is a power that comes with integrating those elements into post-secondary education. And so that's how I'm choosing to define it in my research.
But what you wrote, right, in that paper that you published in forget the exact journal right now.
Frontiers.
Yeah, Frontiers, right? I think the conversation was around how HBCUs are falling short of internationalization goals, but you push back on that and really disrupt that to say it's not that they're falling short, but the definition is incomplete and not reflective of the HBCU experience, particularly Black internationalism. So can you talk more about Black internationalism, right? And then what that looks like, particularly at HBCUs? And you mentioned the example earlier with sport, but how you've seen that both in your research and your work as a director at Howard?
Well, so Black internationalization or Black internationalism?
Black internationalism first.
Okay, well, so Black internationalism forms an element of my framework, Black internationalization. Black internationalism is this, it's a movement, it's a discipline, it's a, it's a variety of different things that takes this history and this legacy of international engagement by Black people in this country and globally with each other to build and or create these things, movements, spaces, etc., that talk about the connectivity of us as Black people on a global scale.
Mm-hmm. How have you seen it at Howard, right? Because you mentioned in your paper, but also in your work, Howard's been doing this, I mean, for decades, hundreds.
Yeah, well, this is kind of the basis of my research. I'm trying to rescue this history of HBCUs, because I have over the years been perplexed or kind of just like, when I go to like conferences and I'm in these spaces and there's all this talk about HBCUs don't do it, and I'm guilty of it myself. I remember when I first came, I would talk badly about HBCUs, like, we're not doing enough, we need to do more, da, da, da. And then but at the same time, I thought about this, something is not connecting for me here, because I know that HBCUs do a lot of things and always have. And so when I stopped to review the history and kind of really think about what has happened over generations, and even, personally in my family with regard to HBCUs, I knew of international engagement. And so to say that HBCUs didn't do anything was incorrect. And I just needed to find a way. I needed to get it out. Like, I needed to find a way to get it out. And so HBCUs have always been engaged internationally. We don't tell our story well, but Howard had had students from China. Howard was founded in 1867. By 1869, there were students from China at Howard. We have the ship's log, the boat that they got off on, in Moreland Spingarn archives. So we've been engaged internationally from almost the very beginning. And so to say that we're not is just inaccurate. It's just that I believe, and this is, where I'm coming from in my research, I just believe that we do it differently and for different reasons. And so that's what I'm doing my dissertation on.
Well, talk to us more about those different reasons, right? Because I think some of the trends you may have observed, even in the last, 3 years, especially as we, entered and are coming out of COVID, I'm sure have been interesting to say the least. But I think I'm curious, and I think those on the call are also curious to learn more about like what the internationalization process at Howard looks like, in particular in your role, but then also some conversations about just internationalization more broadly, thinking about in particular mobility as we think about student mobility, but then also jumping into athlete mobility as well.
Well, the process at Howard is all of these things. It's the student mobility, both outgoing, study abroad, incoming, international students. It's a process of internationalizing the curriculum. So, when I first got to Howard, we didn't have a professor that I am aware of, for example, in the political science department that specialized in the Middle East. That's a problem. I found that to be problematic, especially since Ralph Bunche is the man that founded our political science department and won the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating peace in the Middle East. So to not have a Middle East specialist in political science, I thought was odd. We do now, but so again, it's a process. Everything may not always work at the same speed or at the same, level, but it's an ongoing process. And then, from the Bunche Center, we are trying to complement that classroom learning with external, complementary speakers, experts, scholars, practitioners, etc., who can speak to a variety of global issues, whether it's, diplomacy or whether it's climate change or what have you. We try to bring in people who are doing the relevant work on these issues that affect the world from where they sit.
And as a result of that, obviously, you created this framework, the Black Internationalization Framework. And I know I'll remind you, right? Collaborative program design, equitable partnerships, diverse destinations, accessible path for international students, and the curriculum centering marginalized voices. One, how'd you get to those 5 tenets, if you will? But then two, what has been the response, especially since publishing that paper, in regards to the Black internationalization framework that sits separate on purpose from the comprehensive internationalization framework that many use in the U.S.?
So Dr. Woodman was very helpful in helping me think through these pillars. And I will preface this with saying these are the pillars as they stand now before I collect my data for my dissertation through interviews with people at HBCUs. Mm-hmm. So they could change, but this is what I think they are right now. And this is what I'm building the framework from at the moment. But, I might add one, I might take one away, I might add two, who knows what will happen. It's a discovery process. It'll be great. But just based on the history that I was able to get a hold of in terms of HBCUs, international engagement, and the trends that I see from the data, these are the pillars that I came up with in terms of to create what I think is the framework for, or the pillars of Black internationalization. So what was your second question?
What's been the feedback or reaction from the community?
It's been great. It's been great feedback. And people seem to be pretty interested in it. I need to finish the dissertation so that we can have even more substantive and in-depth conversations about it. But the feedback has been very positive so far.
So this is good, right? We're laying the framework, both literally and figuratively, for both this conversation, but also the rest of the week. Because one thing that I've realized, especially being in the student affairs program in Maryland, is that in really discovering, I guess, my research topic or question, if you will, is that what's happening, particularly within college sport, is part of this process, whether athletics chooses to engage either deliberately or not, that we need to be discussing. So what I'm confused, again, I would just love to have just dialogue now, is like, what is sport missing? Like, why do you think we're not talking about this in the way that we need to be? What help, support, or intentional action do you need from sport to help drive internationalization priorities at your institution, but also globally as well? But I'm just thinking about that, like, if it's happening at other schools, it's happening at Howard as far as the internationalization process, internationalization or Black internationalization, whichever route you want to include in this conversation, what is sport missing? Like, what are we not doing to help support these goals that are definitely priorities by institutions across the United States?
I think that there is and this doesn't go just for athletics. I think there's a disconnect across institutions writ large between internationalization and literally everything else. For us who are in the field of internationalization, I think it's very easy for us to see how it cuts across everything. Yep. But that's because we sit in the internationalization space. But when you talk to the athletic director, or when you talk to the architecture professor, or when you talk to the registrar, or different colleagues around the university, whether they be faculty or administration, I think there is. And that's why it's important to define it. But even after we define what internationalization is, there's still a disconnect, because people across the institution think that study abroad is internationalization. and really, or maybe they think it's international students coming to campus is internationalization. And that's it. They don't understand the range of the elements that make up the internationalization process. And so there's a disconnect between that. And so I think you having conversations like this and putting it on the radar, going to conferences and challenging people to think about what are these connections, what are we missing? I think we're missing data. I think we're missing a lot of data about, like what you just told me before we got started about the flip of the decrease in enrollment for international students in the US is reverse for athletes, right?
Mhm.
That's what you just told me.
Mhm.
There's an increase in international athletes coming to the US, but a decrease in general international students coming to the US. Why is that happening? Exactly. Wow. Why is that happening? And I don't think that athletic departments are looking for who's going to be a star player, who's going to contribute to the team winning the championship. And where are they coming from? It doesn't matter as long as they come to us, and they don't think about,
Yep.
well, when this international student comes to our institution, when they're not on the field or the court with us, they're engaging with their peers and other students and administrators and faculty, and they're bringing all of what they bring from their home to campus.
Yep.
That's what international students do. And the international student athletes also do that.
This is good. And I see a question in the chat from Tatiana. I'll get to that in a second, because I think the challenge for me right now is to figure out, how do I communicate like what we're talking about in a sports setting? I think in sports we get lazy, right? And you mentioned focusing on championships and money, commercialization, which is very obvious. But I think also are either intentional desires, but also byproducts of comprehensive internationalization. But I'm thinking about, one, like, how do I communicate this to athletic departments? But then two, though they don't see themselves as part of, though we as in college sport, as part of this larger university community, they're still engaging in internationalization practices that are part of this process at the institution, right? So for example, Ole Miss women's basketball is going to Italy in July. There's the Gamecock women's basketball teams playing Notre Dame in France in November, right? They're doing this on purpose, right? And I think we can talk about the why. We're going to assume at least the why in this conversation. But at least for me, and for those on the call who work in sport, which goes to Tatiana's question, like, how can we communicate, but also change the understanding of internationalization within the college sports setting? Like, what are there's language, terminology, articles, books? You know what I mean? Like, what can we be doing? What language can we be sharing to help college sports see their role in really relationship with this internationalization process at their institution?
I think that it's going to have to be constant and consistent communication with them. I think so. When the pandemic started and we all went virtual, I was like, oh, what are we going to do? Yep. Nobody's going abroad. So what are we like? How do we justify our jobs? One of the things that we did was we put together an internationalization workshop, and we gave it to everybody on the staff in our office of the provost. We gave it to everybody on staff in student affairs, and we gave it to everybody on staff in the development alumni relations office. We could have done it, and probably should still do it, with the athletic office. But it was an hour-long workshop, and we were just talking about, let's just talk about some definitions. We talked about how you in your office, whether it's student affairs or development or whatever, have a role to play in internationalization. Athletic departments need to hear that. They need to hear it regularly. And they need to be, I think there needs to be a lot more connection and collaboration between, whether it's the international student office or the study abroad office or what have you, to talk about, well, when the athletes go abroad, what are they going to be doing? Like, are you just playing the game, or what else are you all doing? When our volleyball team went to Botswana and Zimbabwe, they played games, but they also did service work with local youth. They did volleyball clinics, etc., for local youth, but they also did other work, and they also learned about what's happening in Botswana and Zimbabwe. And so they have that, they bring that back with them to campus. So it wasn't just they're going to go and play a volleyball match. There are all these other elements that came to it, and our office worked with them on that. And so now, since that trip happened, the men's volleyball team went to Valencia, Spain. And I know you can only go on these trips every 4 years. So we're talking about another women's volleyball trip because that was 4 years ago. So it's time for them to do another one. So yeah, there's a lot of, I think there has to just be a lot more communication. And I think the athletics offices need to be brought into the fold of, we just have to paint a very vivid picture for them and how help them understand what it is. I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what it is and what it is that we're trying to do and how they support it by doing what they do.
This is good. I'm talking to a woman named Elizabeth on Thursday, who serves as the associate director for NCAA International Outreach and Strategic Partnerships. And I'm curious, I'm going to ask her this question because I'm brainstorming right now, but like, what is the conversation about internationalization at the national office? Because a lot of the work at the national office primarily focused on international student mobility, to which you already, challenged earlier, is not internationalization. So I'm definitely curious. I'm going to ask her that question on Thursday. But I want to jump to the chat real quick to answer Tatiana's question more directly. I mean, as a student, undergraduate or grad, what can they do to start changing the understanding of internationalization on college campuses? So I guess, how do you teach this to the students you work with at Howard?
Ooh, that's a great question. We probably don't teach it well enough, actually, now that I think about it. I mean, I try to talk about internationalization, the process, but I think people really want the tangible parts of it. They want the measurable parts of it. They want the sexy parts of it. They want study abroad. And that's, I mean, honestly, the mobility piece is the easiest thing to measure.
Yep.
And it's the thing that people most want to do. Everybody wants to go somewhere, and if they can, they will. So it makes everybody gets excited about that mobility part. But yes, it is not the only part of the internationalization process. I think that it's important to have, and this is where internationalization gets a little fuzzy, because the study abroad is the most easily measurable part. Mm-hmm. But the other things are also important. The internationalizing of the curriculum, like how do we ensure that what is being taught in the classrooms is comprehensive and inclusive of the world and not just one part of the world, in terms of what our students are learning, and also the intersections of the disciplines. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people are getting much more interdisciplinary. I know we're getting much more interdisciplinary. We just launched a couple of weeks ago a new department at Howard called Environment, Earth, and Equity. So it is focused on it. It's the evolution from our environmental studies program to this other thing that talks about those three things, but particularly like the equity part when it comes to environmental justice and so forth. And so having these conversations where everything is, interconnected and the lines are blurred, I think are important. When we're talking about internationalization, mm-hmm. everything overlaps. Literally everything overlaps, because we know we are no longer just the United States of America. We're no longer just, South Africa. We're no longer just France. Everything is in constant motion and everyone is doing things together.
So you mentioned internationalization being a process, right? And I guess the question, particularly as you're talking with different departments on campus, both during the pandemic, but also even now, like, what is the goal, if any? Like, what is the goal that you're communicating and or sharing, and or questions that people may be asking as you're talking about this connected process that everyone needs to, get on board with?
What is the goal of the process?
Yeah, as you communicated with
Yeah,
other
it's
parties.
I was just I think that's where I was going and I got pulled into a tangent, but that's kind of what's in it's difficult to measure that. What is the goal? Well, we want our students to be able to be functioning, contributing members of a 21st century global community at the end of the day. But what does that mean and how do you measure it? It's very hard to do that. People have come up with all these indexes or, like tests to test your intercultural skills. Yes, you could probably test for some things, but I think also at the end of the day, I want our students to just be aware. I want them to be aware of themselves first, and then of themselves and their place in the world. And that happens often when you leave your place of comfort, but it also happens when you know more about other people, other places, other cultures, other traditions, etc., and know that there's no one way to do what you think there's only one way to do. There's so many other ways to do this. And so I started to say, what is the goal when you asked the last question? And I was like, what is the answer to that question? What is the goal? Like, I know that I want, and this has been, I think, probably the greatest challenge for those of us in the field of international education is how do we convey, or because people want data, people want to be able to measure something. And it's very difficult to measure the personal growth and impact that people have when they have had the opportunity to engage the world, whether that's from a class on, Middle East politics on your home campus, or whether you go and spend a semester in Jordan. It's very hard to measure that.
It's a good question and a good lead into another question that's in the chat. And I think both are, well, one's targeted directly to me. I think the other we can both answer. But Jerry asked, can you share your thoughts about how name, image, and likeness can possibly contribute to increasing international athletes enrollment on campus? That's a great question. And how this increase in the diversity of international athletes can contribute to the internationalization process. So I'd like to start with the second question first, particularly hearing from you, and then I can jump into my own bag, if you will, about this NIL piece. But thinking about the increase of international athletes, we mentioned earlier, at least I told you earlier before the call, you mentioned it during this call as well, that while international athlete enrollment at HBCUs, international student enrollment at HBCUs have decreased, international athlete enrollment at HBCUs have increased during the same time period. In a similar way, right, during the COVID pandemic, but also the last due prior to Biden, I was elected in office, international student enrollment went down while international athlete went up. And so just from your perspective, and just initial organic thoughts, how can you see an increase of international athletes on US campuses contributing to this internationalization process more globally?
How the increase is going to contribute to internationalization? I mean,
if at all, yeah.
Well, just their mere presence on campus is always a positive thing in terms of the internationalization process. It allows our students, particularly our students who do not have an opportunity to study abroad, it allows them to engage with people from different places in the classroom, on the yard, in the cafeteria, etc. And that in and of itself facilitates building bridges. It happens. Now, you can add to that some intentionality with their presence on campus through student affairs programming or, other types of programming that celebrates the presence of international students on a campus, whether they're athletes or not. If there's, I don't know, if there's a lot of international athletes, I don't know, there's so many like different things that you could do to highlight and celebrate presence of international student athletes on campus around programming, athletic programming, etc.
So I think that's the part that's missing. And I think that's where my dissy comes in a lot of ways, is that like I've been blessed to be in both rooms, if you will, right? Both departments, if you will, and having like talking international ed about sport, but also talking to athletics about international ed. And it's a code switch every single time for that matter. But I think to that question about internationalization, but also like the new, not even the nuances, but the misconception in regards to what it is for athletic departments, or really particularly coaches, like the goal, and especially in this recruiting piece, is championships.
Right.
And so my communication is like, how do I communicate that like you taking better care and or engaging this more deliberately can help you win championships, which is obviously incomplete and needs more, tied to that. I'm glad you mentioned that earlier. But I think to this first part about NIL contributing to increasing international athlete enrollment, I think that's an interesting piece to at least dive further in, which we'll definitely do tomorrow at noon. But thinking about, because of the fact that obviously their F1 visa, they cannot necessarily monetize their NIL in the US, what would be the draw for them to continue to come to the US to study and compete as an international athlete, as they see their domestic peers making money and they can?
Ooh, I didn't know that. They can't, huh?
Most say no. There have been very few examples of lawyers going to get P1 and O1, professional athlete and extraordinary ability visas for international athletes to monetize in the US. But most international, not yet, only if they're created. Exactly. Yeah, Jerry, don't get nobody in trouble in this call, dog. But most say no, obviously, to protect their visa status as an F1 student. But I think that's super interesting, particularly thinking about, again, how do I communicate both internally to athletics, if I choose to stay and work in sport, but also communicate to international ed that like, I need y'all to think more about this, because for me, it's like, whether it's NASFA or any other international ed conference, they push international athletes to the athletic department. Athletic departments are pushing international athletes to like ISSS, compliance offices, and no one is centering their experience in an explicit and deliberate way to really give voice and humanity to their experience on a college campus. So as you made that framework, the Black internationalization framework, I'm like, yo, is there another framework that I can create, should create, consider?
So, okay, hold on. You got my wheels spinning here real quick.
Jerry got our wheels spinning, not me.
Because, so I didn't know that piece about international athletes not being able to capitalize on the NIL, but here's some things to think about. As you were talking, I'm thinking, so first you just mentioned that, for example, South Carolina is playing Notre Dame in France, right? South Carolina, everybody's watching the South Carolina women these days in this country. That should, if it hasn't already, obviously they're going to France, so somebody cares about that in France. When they go to France, they're probably going to have the red carpet rolled out for them. So the viewership in France and probably in Western Europe is going to go through the roof, which means then that maybe some French players are going to want to come to Notre Dame and or South Carolina. Okay, fine. But that also means that in France, if they're French, they might not be able to make money in the United States NIL stuff, but they could probably make money in France.
But that, again, sport not thinking like that. And I've said this on multiple occasions. I'm like, why are we not thinking about this more comprehensively? Like, there is an out. There's an option.
This is global. I mean, the most watched sport is soccer, football, because the football, the British would like soccer. What is that? Football. For the rest of the normal world, is football. Mm-hmm. And those people make so much money. Yep. And so if athletic departments at universities were really thinking globally, and if money was the driver, or even if it was recruiting the best players from all over the world, the visibility that comes from these international matches that are clearly increasing, that means that those institutions are going to have a much higher international visibility. Mm-hmm. And that means that sponsors from outside of the United States could potentially be building partnerships with the universities in the United States, which means that the players that don't qualify for NIL in the US could easily qualify for doing that, making money, etc., whatever rules apply in their home country to do that. They're probably, if if a woman from France comes and plays for South Carolina Gamecocks, then they're going to be famous in France.
Right.
Easily.
Right.
Which means they could get sponsorship with French companies and they'll be famous in France. They might not be famous in the US, but they could easily be famous in France, which means that player in France is now raising the visibility of South Carolina in France and probably in lots of other countries in Europe. And I mean, these are endless here, but that's where I think the athletic departments probably need to be painted a much broader picture about what this could even possibly look like. And to that end, senior administrators in the universities, because, okay, I'm uncomfortable with doing this to promote, the making of money, like, for the institutions, but everybody has their reasons for what it is going to drive them to do one thing. At the end of the day, if we're going to get more international students on our campuses and we're going to support them and we want to make it kind of more of a level playing field, pardon the pun, then these offices and the senior administrators at the universities, I think, they're going to have to start thinking a little further outside of the box, or just generally outside of the box, when it comes to how they're going to do this and how they're going to support the international students when they're on campus. And that was the other part that when my wheels were turning, was the sense of belonging that, I think could be better. Because to your point, the coaches and the athletic directors, they're looking for the best players to win the championship. And they do need to be making sure that their international players or international athletes have they'll have probably most likely their team as a sense of community, but they're some things are gonna they're all learning from each other, different traditions, different practices, etc. And so there has to be some intentionality behind supporting the international athletes to make sure that they have a sense of belonging that celebrates where they come from and make sure that they feel good where they are.
Let me say this before I forget. And for those who have questions, we have about 10 or so minutes left during this session tonight. So make sure you drop your questions in the chat if you want us to answer them. But sense of belonging, and speaking to my athletic department friends in particular, is not just a potluck, nor an international athlete night. And I think college sports has gotten lazy in hosting potlucks and waving flags at sports games and calling it sense of belonging. And that just frustrates the F out of me, Dr. Hope. Like it really, really does. Because I'm like, what are we doing here? And again, it's celebrated again on whether it's the NCAA's website or department's website, et cetera. But it's so much deeper than, again, sharing food and waving your flag around. Right. But I think part of that goes to the level of commitment and awareness of both coaches, staff, senior leadership within athletic departments. But then too, as you're talking, and really what my DISI is focused on is international athlete career development. And so I'm thinking about whether it's the NIL piece, right, or team tours or study abroad, how do we also internationalize career education curriculum to introduce international careers for both US students, but also international athletes as they go back to their home country or third country to be employed in those countries, given that the NCAA is not easily understood nor exists in their home country.
Well, I took some students to London over spring break, and there was an alum. Was that?
I saw that joint. Why you ain't take me? I told you need to start taking on these trips, yo. I can supervise, participate, whatever you need me to do.
We had a Howard alum who was there, who he majored in sports marketing. And he was an athlete. He played soccer for Howard. Okay. But he was British of Ghanaian descent. And he went to Howard and now he's back in London. He works for a sports marketing company. So we did a tour of Emirates Stadium while we were in London. Yeah, that was,
you know what I'm saying?
That was dope. That was dope. Not gonna lie. But he came with us on the tour. And so he had a lot of insight because he works with a lot of athletes, in the Premier League and other sports spaces. But the support for international students in terms of career support development is not just for athletes. It goes for all international students. I don't think that we do it. I don't think we do it well. And it goes back to what I said earlier about a fundamental kind of misunderstanding of what internationalization is and how we support international students, period, athletes or not. There is, in the US, we're like this. I guess maybe we assume everybody just wants to stay here. And so we're talking out of both sides of our mouths because we want students to come to the US, and supposedly we want them to go home to work in the places where they came from. A lot of times international students end up staying here, but that's probably because no one at the US institution knows how to help them get a job at home, because they're not thinking about that. They're only thinking about how do we get them to have OPT so they can stay in the US for another year. They're not thinking about, oh, well, this person is a sports marketing major. We should probably make some relationships with the Premier League, the biggest, most lucrative sports, and I just made that up. I'm assuming it's the biggest, most lucrative sports league in the world. Why does not every US institution have a relationship with Premier League soccer?
I'm coming, Dr. Hope. Hey, I'm coming.
You need to go faster.
Hey, look, I'm doing my best, but here's the thing, yo. No one listens. This is why I wanted you to kick off the summit, right? As we begin to close out this piece, because to that point about the career piece, no, it's a blanket statement, but I don't care. It's my platform. People on college campuses, I love it here, but people on college campuses don't listen to anything international student career development related if it's not a white man lawyer talking about OPT. Okay. I don't know, because I've sat in those sessions and it's very bland, very dry. It talks just straight, particularly about the visa process in the US. And so to that point, it's like, whether it's engaging in the process, whether it's being, I don't know, using more common sense to think about, careers outside of the US, whether it's building those, let me use your language exactly, equitable partnerships outside of the US. Like, we can really do this in a way that makes sense and hits these goals that are either very explicit and or byproducts of this internationalization process, to where all parties are served in a way that's equitable and socially just. But I think for me, what's been frustrating, but also inspiring at the same time, is that frustrating because of lack of racial diversity in particular as it relates to international education, internationalization, conversation, but inspiring because people like, whether it's Christina, who just had to jump off, or yourself, Corey, who are continuing to lead these conversations both in the national and international scene to help us think more critically about what's happening both in the US, but also how we need to engage more outside of this country. So I want to say thank you for just being present and leading in that way.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Give you Antonio. Whoa, yeah. Hey, we're gonna jump through this shit this week, yo. This is not a game. But segment 3, I love it here. It's ours, yo. I'm gonna code switch. But how can I, in our podcast community, the Walk with TAB community, best support you, future Dr. Tonija Hope? I can assume one of the things is around this IRB that's going to be approved, hopefully sooner than later. But how can we best support you, yo? You and your work, your life journey, your purpose. What can we do? What can I do?
Well, you can follow me personally. You already do, but you can follow me on social media. You connect with me on LinkedIn. Connect with the Bunche Center on all of our platforms, whether it's LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and just you can sign up for our newsletter. You can do that via our website, global.howard.edu. But yeah, get engaged. If you are at an institution and you're in the international education field, go and talk to your athletic director and see what's up. Figure out a way to partner with them. And in terms of my work personally and professionally, if you're in the international education field, think about how you as an individual are approaching your work, and then how is your organization approaching that work? Who's at the center of your work? Is it who's at the center of your work? What is it? What is your approach? And then think about maybe doing things a little differently. And then, of course, you're always welcome to send a donation to the Bunche Center. We would not reject those. And it's important to note, though, that while we do first and foremost put our Howard University students first, the work that we do at the Bunche Center is really for collective uplift. And so we really try to make sure that we know that we have a responsibility to a greater community. And so we do what we can to make sure that we have our resources available to all 105 or 7, however you want to count, HBCUs and their students. And anyone else who, wants to maybe think about things in a little bit of a different way, even if you're at a PWI, we will not hold that against you. It's all right. We're glad you're there. You need to be there if you are at a PWI, and if you're at a PWI and you're listening to this podcast, this summit, it's important that you go back to your PWI and have these conversations and talk about Black internationalization, talk about how you can do things maybe a little differently, center some different people, and see what happens.
I told you I'm gonna use your framework for my Dissy, yo. Like you just inspired me, dog. You're a legend. I had to kick off this somewhat a legend, so I'm glad you said yes, dog. For real. But 3 things before we go. Number 1, the sun is setting, which means it's time to put this espresso down and drink some rosé. So I'm gonna get us out here pretty quickly. Number 2, where you get your frames from, man? Warby?
No, this is my eye doctor.
Oh. Local? Was it DMV local?
Yeah.
Oh,
that's called my eye doctor. My eye doctor.
See, these are blue light glasses. He's not really, I mean, they real, but they're not prescription like that. But then 3, I'm looking for a job. So if you want to hire me to be your like internationalization, sport, whatever person, like I'm down the street, bro.
I'll talk to our athletic director, and maybe we get you on the athletic team. Then, we'll be golden. Yes, actually, I'm going to do that. I'm going to talk to him.
Please do. But for everyone else, man, Dr. Tonija Hope, future Dr. Tonija Hope, thank you for being here. Again, seriously do appreciate this conversation, and definitely believe it set the tone for the conversations we'll have the rest of the week. Our week is jam-packed with a number of different sessions with, again, speakers from all over the world, which is very exciting, but also a testament to the Walk with TAB community that we built over the last 3 years. So thank y'all for joining tonight's opening session. For everyone else, man, make sure y'all tune in to other sessions throughout the week. Again, this episode will be dropped on the podcast and on our YouTube channel within the coming weeks. I'm not gonna put a timeline on it. But again, thank y'all for coming tonight. Look forward to seeing y'all later in the week. But as always, we're walking. Peace out.
Thank you. Bye.